This is America, and this is the White House, where Donald Trump's Memorandum of Understanding has already led to a drop in oil prices. I'll be back shortly to look at how it's also impacted other countries involved in the war. But for now, to Neave Barker in our Washington studio.
Thank you, Alan. Well, the devil is in the details, and White House officials have publicly laid out the terms for Donald Trump's Memorandum of Understanding to end the war with Iran. It will halt hostilities for 60 days to allow time for a final agreement to be reached. The Strait of Hormuz will be reopened almost immediately, and the US naval blockade of the strait will be lifted. Iran will never produce nuclear weapons. It will also include these terms that were being reported by US media earlier in the day.
The draft calls for the U.S. to waive sanctions so Tehran can immediately start selling oil on the global market. That happens immediately, one of the few things that does besides opening the Strait of Hormuz. There is also a provision for a $300 billion development fund if Iran holds up its end of the bargain on nuclear negotiations down the line.
Well, despite White House officials publicly saying the $300 billion provision is part of the MoU, President Trump says Washington won't be paying anything.
No, we're not investing. We're not putting up 10 cents. And people can decide to do that, but that's up to them. I mean, do you want me to say nobody's ever allowed to invest in a country? We are not investing in it, and we do not have a fund. That's a false story that got picked up incorrectly, but we are not investing 10 cents.
Here's our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, with more from the White House.
106 days of war. And now what we have is a peace of sorts. Well, what there is a memorandum of understanding. 14 points on 2 pieces of paper, which stops the fighting and lays the framework for future discussions.
The biggest thing is they will not have a nuclear weapon. And that's the reason I got in, and that's the reason I agreed to sign.
With an official ceremony planned for Friday, the economic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz will reopen. The Iranians claim to have effectively closed it, pushing up oil prices, pushing up economic pressure on countries around the world, including Donald Trump's America. Oil prices are already dropping, but that'll take a while to find its way to consumers, even though Gulf countries will again find their way to eager world markets. The US blockade and Iran will be eased. There will be 60 days for discussions to reach a final deal to test each other's limits, something the war has already done. The US and its ally use military power to pummel Iran, destroy its navy, cripple its air force. They killed the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Trump said at one point he would only accept the unconditional surrender of Iran, the submission of the government in Tehran. But Iran struck back at America, at its bases in the region, and at Israel. Before the war, there were calls between the Oval Office and Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu convinced the president that a war would mean a new Iran, a new government, a new Middle East. But there was no uprising, and the same groups are still in control in Tehran. And now, as talks get underway, there's no seat at the negotiating table for Israel. J.D. Vance will lead the American delegation. They have clear goals, important issues to address and resolve, he says. They've tried before, but there have been gaps that have been impossible to close. Details matter, and hanging over the talks, the latest threat from Donald Trump.
They're not going to acquire a nuclear weapon. If they do, all hell will rain down on them.
A reminder that a short-term deal has ended the war for now. A long-term deal still doesn't exist. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, at the White House.
OK, well, we are joined now by Jen Gavito, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, and by Ariel Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. A very, very warm welcome to both of you. Good to have you on This Is America. So let's firstly, out of the gates, establish what the heck we're talking about when we mention the phrase Memorandum of Understanding. President Trump has been all over social media in recent days talking about a finalized peace deal. But now, take a listen, he's saying this.
No, it's not final. It's a memorandum of understanding. And if I don't like it, we'll go back to shooting at them, dropping bombs on their head. If I don't like it, if they don't behave, we'll go right back to dropping bombs right smack in the middle of their head.
So, if the Memorandum of Understanding, doesn't meet his expectations, he says he'll go back to shooting and dropping bombs. The document, we know, is explicitly a Memorandum of Understanding. It's not a deal, so an interim framework meant to pave the way for those 60 days of talks, right? Jennifer, as somebody who's familiar with how these things get established, how and why is this memorandum now in place? Explain where we are right now. Set the scene, if you may.
Sure. So I think later in the press conference, the president said something along the lines of, we could continue bombing them for 2 days, 2 weeks, for 2 years. I think we're here today because the president has understood that continued military campaign is unlikely to fundamentally change the state of play in these negotiations. And so what we're dealing with, I think, is fundamentally a cutting of losses. So you have this framework agreement that I think is more or less an extension of the ceasefire that has more or less been in place just with the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. It doesn't get at any of the hard questions. It certainly doesn't address nuclear, and notably, it doesn't address the missile program. It doesn't address the proxies. It doesn't really go after any of the strategic objectives that the president laid out at the beginning of this conflict. And so it is hard to imagine at the end of this that we have anything more than the resumption of global commerce. But I would just note that the president's comment about, if we don't like it, is one of the reasons that there is so much distrust on both sides. And that is, I think, really important to keep in mind as they enter into the second phase.
Right, Ariel, on that point, it sounds like an ultimatum wrapped up in diplomacy, or the other way around.
This is an attempt to seize a defeat from the jaws of victory. Militarily, U.S. performed very well. And I will respectfully disagree with Jennifer. I think that, and with the president, by the way, I think Iran is in a very precarious situation, not just because the military was destroyed, but because its economic life is in a very precarious point, especially on water. I wrote recently a column for Forbes where I'm analyzing the Iranian threats against desalination of the Gulf state and say people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. Iranian water supply is down 75 to 85%, and they should not have messed with that. And also, the Iranian leadership, as fanatical as it may be, has a country to run. If the country doesn't have energy infrastructure, industrial capacity, and its infrastructure is essentially bombed, and it cannot export oil, which could be achieved in 1 or 2 weeks of additional bombing, then how would they run a country? It would take $1 trillion to rebuild it back, and nobody is going to give it to them.
So we're at this juncture where both sides at least appear on paper to want to move things forward. Jen, you seem to suggest that this is all about keeping the markets calm while maintaining a kind of hair-trigger military posture. Is that what you mean?
Sure. I mean, I do think that we can't keep troops at the levels that we have them indefinitely. And indeed, part of the memorandum suggests that U.S. troops will start to redeploy should things move forward. But I think for the president, there were two priorities. The first was to get global commerce moving again through the reopening of a strait that I think it's important to remember was open 110 days ago when this started. But secondly, to get a renewed commitment on nuclear. That commitment is very vague. It mirrors what the Iranian regime has been saying for years, but it gets back to a degree of stability that allows things essentially to move forward and for the president to focus attention elsewhere. So it is a shaky calm.
But they did not rule out entirely that Iran will seize global commons. They'll seize international waters that before this conflict, Iran did not control. And the Strait of Hormuz connects two bodies of international waters.
Let's get into that, Ariel, if we may, because I'm keen to focus on what Washington hopes to get out of this. In the short run, we're talking about reduced pressure on energy markets. You've already mentioned that, Jen. Lower inflation concerns here at home. You've got a large map of the Strait of Hormuz over there. Let's get that full frame so our viewers at home can see. So we know that, that there is clearly a huge amount of congestion still here in this highly important waterway. The dots, the arrows that you're looking at, they are oil tankers. The green ones are cargo ships. The US insists that Iran has to open the Strait of Hormuz. But you can see there seems to be an awful lot of hesitancy. Clusters of tankers off the coast of Dubai. Let me take you up here, just south of Bandar Abbas. This is the Iranian coast. This is precisely the area where the Iranians launched their maritime protocol, basically charging vessels who are up for it or have no choice to pay the Iranians money for safe transit through the strait. In theory, we're talking about these protocols no longer being in place, and the US naval blockade, which currently occupies about this area, if not a little bit wider, in the Gulf of Oman, in theory, that coming to an end as well. But there's a problem, isn't there? Iran is still talking about retaining administrative management of the waterway. It's talking about transit security compliance. Jen, I mean, so did the US actually secure free shipping lanes, or did it entrench the Iranians' new status quo in the Strait of Hormuz?
So I think, first of all, the insurance companies will be the best ones to answer that question, right? I mean, you won't have free transit until the insurance companies are willing to insure the ships that are going through there. The rest of it remains an enormous open question, including because at least one draft of the Memorandum of Understanding seemed to suggest that Iran itself would be responsible for the demining that has to be done before there can be safe transit. So I think that there will be a return to significant levels of transit through the strait, but both for reasons of capacity of Gulf states, given the damage that's been done to infrastructure, but also because of some of these limiting reasons, including security and insurance. It is going to be a considerable amount of time still before we see anything resembling normalcy, and that's even once you clear out the hundreds of vessels that are still essentially stuck.
Transit security compliance, I mean, if Donald Trump or the Iranians had called it a toll, a tax, or a fee, it would have immediately been blown up, wouldn't it?
Well, now we don't know if it's going to be blown up because the president puts, lipstick on the pig here. The precedent of taking away the free passage in the global commons is dangerous for the vital American security interests in the Taiwan Straits, in the South China Sea, in the Strait of Malacca, and I would venture to say in the Bosphorus that connects two international bodies of water, just like the Strait of Hormuz, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and even Skagerrak in Denmark that was controlled by Denmark until 1802, and they collected tolls till the British Navy showed up and burned them down.
Ariel, you make a very interesting point I want to put to you, Jen, because if the US implicitly tolerates Iran monitoring, as it hopes to do, this kind of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, it sets a weird precedent, doesn't it, as Ariel has suggested. I mean, what does that say to America's reputation as being the custodians of international trade through important bodies of water?
This is really problematic. This would be, I think, a devastating development for our Gulf allies. It would be a devastating precedent in a number of global conflicts, not to mention especially when you talk about the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait. And so, this does, as you note, inherent damage to the reputation of the United States as an international arbiter of the common good. And I think that probably is a red line of sorts for the Trump administration. I'm also not sure that we're going to see this come into play immediately. If true, that Iran will immediately have access to oil waivers, they stand to, by some accounts that I've seen, achieve $300 billion in revenue from that. Then you're talking about sanctions relief. So do they need to press that button right now? Do they need to deploy that? If they're getting revenue, if they're getting the economic relief that is so critical, that arguably was their top priority in these negotiations, through other means, then maybe the strait becomes something that they hold in their back pocket, able to deploy again when the time is right, when they feel like they are, under pressure.
Jennifer, I would argue that this regime does not always recognize where the red lines are, and balance and poise is not necessarily its distinguishing characteristic. I'm talking about the Iranian regime.
Yeah, of course.
And they consistently overplay their hand and push and push. And at some point, there may be a pushback, as we heard from the president. Unfortunately, what I would like to see is a little bit more nuance from the president and not a binary bomb, not bomb type of position.
What we are seeing pretty clearly, though, is that oil prices have already started to drop off the back of the news of this memorandum of understanding.
And that was very important because
Do you think the market's being naive, though, I'm wondering?
But this is absolutely important for President Trump because of the midterms. His popularity is what, about 30% approval? The inflation is 4.2 instead of 2.4 before the hostilities started. He needs very quickly to play it back to the point where Republicans are not going to lose the Senate, and the outcome on the House is pretty much looks like today they're going to lose the House.
This feels a bit like irrational exuberance, though, in that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is near record lows in the United States. Again, the on-ramp to getting production levels back up to what they were, getting transit back to normal. The markets are reacting to political news. They're not necessarily reacting yet to an infusion of additional supply into the market.
Okay, let's move on and talk specifically about Iran. We've already touched upon Iran already, but I want to play you another clip from Donald Trump where he appears to completely flip his prior narrative on the country. Let's take a listen.
You talk about regime change. I never cared about regime change. It's never a part, but I guess you have regime change because you know better than anybody. The first group, they're all dead. The second group, they're dead. A part of the third group is gone. And we're dealing with people that I think are very rational people. I mean, they were nice to deal with. They were strong people, smart people. I think actually they're smarter than the first and second group.
So, Jen, I want to put this to you because Iran entered this conflict as an international pariah under a huge amount of military pressure, didn't it? But now they appear to be exiting as negotiating partners. I mean, from a policy standpoint, how did the US allow Tehran to convert this kind of military containment into, I guess, increased diplomatic leverage?
So we should be crystal clear that the regime that is in Tehran is every bit as destructive as the regime that it was at the beginning of this conflict, arguably even more so with the IRGC having consolidated control. Their red lines have been largely adhered to, whether it is redevelopment of their missile program, restocking, they're already working on that, projection of their proxies through the region. This is not a trustworthy regime. It is not a trustworthy negotiating partner. That remains true. As far as diplomatic credibility, I think this is going to be a challenge for the United States to navigate because those are factual statements that our Gulf allies know, that our European allies know. And so I think in some ways we are almost on a collision course. I mean, the European Union said yesterday, representatives of Europe said yesterday that there will be no sanctions relief, for example, by Europe until there are verifiable steps forward. That puts the US and Europe fundamentally in different places on this. And the Gulf in all of this remains very exposed, both because of the ability to continue to shut down the strait in the future, whatever they do now, but also because, you know, kind of the Band-Aid is off as far as striking out at the Gulf specifically. And so I do think, again, that this is damaging for the U.S. and will be very difficult for the president to navigate in the weeks ahead as he tries to reassure partners that this is not giving credibility to the regime.
Ariel, the MoU reportedly mentions potential sanctions relief and $300 billion in development financing. We've been struggling to understand exactly what that means. Is that the release of frozen assets? Is that something else? Because we know that Vice President Vance has been downplaying the idea of releasing any cash to the Iranians.
Until they change their behavior or whatnot. And I think let's start with the nature of the regime. I think a lot of folks may not understand what was the difference between Velayat al-Faqih with Ayatollah Khamenei, the late Ayatollah, running things and being the authority, and a fake Ayatollah now that nobody saw, nobody knows where he is, et cetera, et cetera. I think IRGC is in charge. And the question that I'm asking myself is this IRGC going to implement or try to implement the same ideology that combines the most radical interpretation of Shia Islam, the Islamic Revolution, and the vestiges or the ideology of the Persian Empire that dominates the Middle East. And until we didn't clarify it, it'll be difficult. The Soviet Union, from where I hail, remained a revolutionary anti-status quo power until it became totally bankrupt under Gorbachev.
Let me ask you this. What happens when you... what happens to leverage if all of a sudden you turn on the financial taps too soon?
You lose it. I mean, I think that's what you're getting at. And to Ariel's point, the president in his press conference today essentially acknowledged that the assets, he said this is Iran's money. This is, of course, is the same argument that President Obama made as part of the JCPOA negotiations, the unfreezing what became known as the pallets of cash. And so I do think they're even walking away from the suggestion that they will withhold those funds for the time being. When you give them access to funds or to oil revenues up front without any verifiable steps forward, they are able to rebuild the missile program, rebuild the drone program.
And rebuild the proxies.
And rebuild the proxies.
The proxies in what I just said about the Iranian ambition to penetrate and control countries in the Middle East, from Yemen to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq, unless there is a clear understanding that proxies are off the table. If Hezbollah wants to be a political party, tfaddalu, let them be a political party.
All right.
But the influx of cash from Iran to tilt the balance of power in the Middle East in favor of Tehran needs to stop.
Understood. Let's talk Israel, if we may, because they're probably the most uncomfortable stakeholders in this Memorandum of Understanding, aren't they? And we know that Donald Trump has been especially critical of Benjamin Netanyahu recently. Have a listen.
I've had a great relationship with Bibi, but now Bibi has to be more responsible with respect to Lebanon. I didn't like where 2 hours before we're signing the agreement that there was an attack in Lebanon, in Beirut. It wasn't like in the southern side, and it was in Beirut. I did not like that. I let them know that. So now I'm not happy with the way Israel has handled themselves with Lebanon and with Hezbollah. They should have been able to do the job faster. It just goes on forever. And when that happens, it throws a negative light on the big deal, and that's the deal with Iran.
Jen, so how does Washington bypass an Israel that's probably feeling quite furious that they've been bypassed by this need to prioritize global energy supplies? I
think there should have been a better understanding up front that Israeli national security objectives diverge from U.S. national security objectives, and that's okay. They were too closely linked, and so Benjamin Netanyahu, especially with elections looming, has every incentive to continue to go hard after the Iranian regime. The United States does not share that incentive. It is far better at this point to end a conflict that is unlikely to change the calculations on the ground, and better to get back to getting global commerce moving again. And so this is put them on a collision course. I'm in no way surprised that Prime Minister Netanyahu would continue to try to undermine this agreement. I think we'll continue to see that because it is, no question, very bad for Israel. I think the president is echoing what a lot of Americans, though, feel about not just Lebanon and Hezbollah, but what we've seen over the last couple of years in Gaza as well, and some real question about how these are executed, but more importantly, what U.S. support for these operations looks like.
From what we understand of the Memorandum of Understanding, it talks of a ceasefire across all fronts, including Lebanon. However, reports suggest that that's not conditional in the immediate withdrawal of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon.
The Iranians said that they want Israel to withdraw. Israel is not going to withdraw as long as the prior agreements, including UN Security Council resolutions about disarmament of Hezbollah and withdrawal of Hezbollah to the points north of the Litani River, will be met. And the other thing was President Trump. I would suggest, if you asked my opinion, not to push Israel into the corner, because if Israel continues to receive missile fire from Hezbollah into northern Israeli towns that are depopulated because people are bombarded since 2023, Israel may take even more severe measures, not just against Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also against Iran.
Where does that leave the Lebanese government? Man, they're caught in the crossfire here, aren't they?
This is very disappointing. You, for the first time in decades, have a Lebanese president, Lebanese government that is willing to take on the very difficult task of Hezbollah. Every time Israel strikes into southern Beirut, South Beirut in particular, that diminishes support for the Lebanese government to take those actions against Hezbollah. And so I do think the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel is real. And yet, if you look at the long term, this is not something that is going to resolve that more permanently.
But the Lebanese government is currently incapable of disarming Hezbollah, and President Trump hinted that he may suggest that the Syrians will do that. And of course, that opens a whole different Pandora's box.
Okay, well, look, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. The time has flown very, very quickly indeed. It's been a pleasure having you both on This Is America. Jennifer Gavito, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, and Ariel Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. The pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much. Well, handing back to Alan Fisher and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. That's all for me, Neave Barker. See you all soon.
In the next episode of This Is America, we look at the core issues raised by the Memorandum of Understanding and whether or not they can be dealt with in 60 days, or whether Donald Trump's Iran strategy is heading for another US stalemate. That's on Thursday at 18:30 GMT, 2:30 PM if you're watching here on the East Coast. In the meantime, from all of the team, thanks for watching and see you soon.